There is a quiet shift happening inside some people, and almost no one talks about it. They didn't become distant overnight. They didn't grow cold, arrogant, or detached from humanity. What changed was more subtle and far more profound. At some point, being around others began to feel heavier than being alone. Conversations started to require effort instead of flowing naturally. Emotional exchanges, once meaningful, began to register as noise, tension, or fatigue. And slowly, without making a conscious decision, solitude started to feel like relief. This isn't about rejecting people. It's about the body learning something the mind took longer to accept. For some, emotional closeness stopped feeling regulating and started feeling draining. The nervous system, after too many cycles of overstimulation, misunderstanding, or emotional responsibility, adapted. It learned that silence was safer than explanation, that distance was calmer than connection, that being alone required less vigilance than being emotionally present with others. From the outside, this shift is often misunderstood. It gets labeled as avoidance, fear of intimacy, or emotional unavailability. But internally, it doesn't feel like running away. It feels like the body finally exhaling. The calm that comes with solitude isn't empty. It's stabilizing. It's the absence of having to monitor tone, manage reactions, absorb moods, or regulate someone else's emotional state. Something fundamental has recalibrated, not at the level of thought, but at the level of physiology. These people didn't withdraw because they disliked connection. They withdrew because connection, as it existed, became incompatible with their nervous system. After enough emotional exhaustion, the body stops negotiating. It doesn't ask whether solitude looks healthy or socially acceptable. It simply chooses what reduces strain. What looks like distance from the outside is often self-preservation from the inside. If any part of this feels familiar, pause for a moment and notice what your body is doing right now. Not what you think about it, but how it feels. That quiet recognition is often the first sign that nothing is wrong with you. Something adapted. If this resonated, like the video so it reaches others who feel this but can't yet name it. Subscribe if you want content that respects depth, regulation, and psychological truth without forcing false positivity. And if you're comfortable, leave a comment with a single word that describes how solitude feels to you now. Sometimes being seen quietly is enough. Long before solitude was framed as avoidance or emotional shutdown, Mary Ainsworth had already identified something most people still misunderstand. Attachment is not governed by intention, morality, or effort. It is governed by the nervous system. In her work on attachment theory, Ainsworth demonstrated that the sense of safety a person feels in relationships is not created by closeness itself, but by regulation. Proximity only works when the body experiences it as stabilizing. When it doesn't, closeness becomes a source of stress rather than comfort. This is where many people turn against themselves. They believe that if they were healthier, more healed, or more emotionally mature, they would crave connection more. But Ainsworth's findings suggest the opposite. The nervous system does not respond to ideals. It responds to patterns. It learns through repeated experience where it can rest, without vigilance, and where it must stay alert to survive. Over time, it builds preferences that are not conscious choices but conditioned responses. Safety, in this framework, has very little to do with how much time you spend with someone or how emotionally open you try to be. Safety is the absence of threat at a physiological level. It is the absence of pressure to perform, to explain, to absorb, to manage. When interactions repeatedly overwhelm the system, even subtly, the body recalibrates. It begins to associate connection with activation and solitude with regulation. This shift happens quietly, beneath language, beneath values, beneath desire. Ainsworth showed that attachment styles are not personality flaws. They are adaptive strategies shaped by what the nervous system learned was possible. When someone begins to prefer solitude, it is often because their system has discovered that being alone requires less self-monitoring, less emotional labor, less internal bracing. The calm they feel is not emotional withdrawal. It is physiological relief. This is why willpower doesn't reverse the pattern. You cannot convince your nervous system to feel safe through logic alone. It doesn't respond to shoulds. It responds to what has consistently reduced or increased strain. From this perspective, choosing distance is not a rejection of intimacy. It is the body choosing the only environment where it knows how to settle. Seen through Ainsworth's lens, this preference for solitude is not defiance, immaturity, or fear. It is learned regulation. The nervous system did not give up on connection. It simply learned where safety actually exists. At some point, many people begin to judge themselves for needing distance. They hear the narratives everywhere, that pulling back means something is broken, that preferring solitude signals avoidance, that wanting less emotional contact must be a sign of unresolved trauma. Over time, this moral framing creates guilt. People start asking what's wrong with them, why they can't handle relationships the way others seem to. But this interpretation misses what is actually happening at a deeper level. Choosing solitude is not the same as pathological isolation. Isolation is marked by fear, numbness, or collapse. What many people experience instead is calm, clarity, and stabilization when they are alone. Their nervous system settles, their breathing slows, their thoughts become less defensive. That response alone tells an important truth. The body is not shutting down, it is regulating. Pathology constricts, regulation restores. It is also not accurate to assume that distance automatically means unresolved trauma. Trauma does not always push people away from others. Very often it pulls them toward repeated overstimulation, people-pleasing, or compulsive connection. In contrast, adaptive withdrawal emerges when the system has learned through lived experience that constant emotional engagement carries a cost. This is not avoidance of feeling. It is discernment about what the body can sustainably tolerate. Seen through this lens, solitude is not a rejection of people. It is a rejection of dysregulation. The nervous system is not making a statement about love, loyalty, or care. It is responding to load. When interactions repeatedly require self-monitoring, emotional labor, or suppression of internal signals, the system does what it is designed to do. It minimizes exposure. That is not selfishness. It is intelligence. The guilt many people feel comes from confusing social expectations with biological needs. Society rewards availability, responsiveness, and emotional openness, even when they come at the expense of regulation. But the nervous system does not operate on moral ideals. It operates on safety. When distance restores equilibrium, it becomes the correct response, regardless of how it looks from the outside. Reframing solitude this way removes self-blame. It allows a person to see that nothing has gone wrong inside them. Something adjusted. The withdrawal is not an attack on connection. It is protection of the system that makes real connection possible in the first place. What most people experience as an emotional problem is often something far more basic and far more physical. Human relationships are not sustained only by words, intentions, or feelings. They rely on co-regulation, the unconscious exchange of nervous system states between people. When two regulated systems interact, calm reinforces calm. But when one or both systems are chronically dysregulated, the interaction becomes taxing, even if no conflict is visible on the surface. In emotionally chaotic environments, the body is constantly working behind the scenes. It scans tone, posture, pauses, micro shifts in mood. It adjusts, anticipates, braces. Over time, this invisible labor accumulates. The person may not consciously register danger or threat, yet their nervous system remains activated. Heart rate stays elevated. Muscles don't fully release. Attention remains outward, monitoring rather than resting. This is not an emotional failure. It is a physiological response to sustained demand. As this pattern repeats, the body begins to form associations. It doesn't think in narratives or intentions. It learns through repetition. If closeness repeatedly coincides with activation, tension, or emotional responsibility, the nervous system quietly links connection with overload. If solitude consistently brings down arousal, restores breathing, and reduces vigilance, it links aloneness with safety. These associations form long before the mind creates an explanation for them. This is why people often say, "I don't know why, but I feel better alone." The knowing came first. The explanation came later. The system learned the pattern before consciousness caught up. By the time the person starts questioning their preferences, the nervous system has already adapted to preserve energy and stability. In this context, withdrawal is not a reaction to people themselves, but to the physiological cost of engagement. The body is not avoiding intimacy. It is avoiding overload. It is choosing the environment where co-regulation is no longer required, where it doesn't have to compensate for emotional noise, unpredictability, or unspoken tension. Understanding this shifts the question entirely. It's no longer, "Why can't I handle relationships?" but "What has my nervous system learned it must do to stay balanced?" The answer is rarely found in thought alone. It lives in patterns the body recognized long before the mind tried to make sense of them. There is usually a moment that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but internally it changes everything. No argument, no betrayal, no clear event to point to. Just a quiet realization that something once manageable has become exhausting. Invitations start to feel heavy before they're even accepted. Conversations require preparation. Social time no longer restores energy. It drains it. And without consciously deciding anything, the body begins to resist. This is not a thought process. It doesn't arrive as a conclusion or a belief. It arrives as sensation. A tightening in the chest before a meeting. A subtle fatigue after speaking. A relief that appears the moment silence returns. The nervous system signals long before the mind finds language for it. What used to feel neutral now feels costly. What once felt connecting now feels like work. At this point, many people try to override the signal. They tell themselves to push through, to be more open, to not become that person who withdraws. But the body doesn't negotiate with narratives. Each time it's ignored, the signal intensifies. Exhaustion deepens. Irritability increases. Even simple interactions begin to leave a residue. The system is not asking for improvement. It is setting a boundary. This is the rupture. Not a dramatic break, but a threshold crossed. From here on, things don't return to how they were through effort alone. The nervous system has learned something essential. Silence restores faster than connection. Stillness regulates more efficiently than engagement. That learning doesn't disappear just because the mind wishes it would. What makes this moment difficult is that it doesn't feel like choice. It feels like inevitability. The body leans toward quiet without consulting the intellect. Alone, breathing deepens, muscles release. Attention returns inward. These are not preferences formed by ideology or fear. They are physiological responses to relief. Calling this avoidance misses the truth. Avoidance is driven by anxiety. This shift is driven by clarity at the somatic level. The system has reached its limit and adjusted accordingly. The withdrawal that follows is not impulsive and not reversible by persuasion. It is the body honoring a boundary that words were never strong enough to enforce. What makes withdrawal feel unavoidable is not a lack of desire for connection, but the accumulating cost of staying. Long before someone chooses distance, their body has been paying a price they couldn't name. Hypervigilance becomes the background state, not dramatic anxiety, but a constant low-level alertness. Listening for shifts in tone, watching reactions, anticipating emotional needs, adjusting words to avoid tension. The nervous system never fully powers down. Over time, this sustained alertness turns into irritability that seems to come from nowhere. Small interactions feel disproportionately draining. Sounds are sharper. Questions feel intrusive. Even neutral moments carry an undercurrent of tension. From the outside, it can look like impatience or moodiness. Internally, it feels like the system is overloaded and running without rest. One of the heaviest costs is the sense of always regulating someone else, being the calm one, the understanding one, the emotionally available one, the person who absorbs, stabilizes, reassures, or adapts. This role often develops unconsciously, especially in relationships where emotional chaos, inconsistency, or unmet needs are present. The body learns to stay on for the sake of connection, even when no one explicitly asks for it. At first, this regulation feels manageable. Then it becomes tiring. Eventually, it becomes unsustainable. The system starts to notice that togetherness requires constant adjustment, while solitude allows it to finally release. Alone, there is no one to monitor, no emotional field to manage, no need to soften, explain, or contain. Muscles loosen, breathing deepens. The internal noise quiets. This is the moment when the equation changes. Being with others no longer feels neutral or nourishing. It feels expensive. Each interaction draws from reserves that are already depleted. Staying becomes an act of endurance rather than connection. And leaving stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like relief. This is why the withdrawal isn't impulsive. It's the result of prolonged imbalance. The nervous system doesn't withdraw because it dislikes people. It withdraws because the cost-benefit calculation has shifted. Being together now costs more than being alone. And when regulation is on the line, the body will always choose the option that allows it to survive. At this stage, what looks like personality change is better understood as a series of quiet adaptations. The nervous system didn't break, it recalibrated. These shifts didn't happen all at once, and they weren't chosen consciously. They emerged because the system needed to function with less strain. Naming them gives form to what many people feel but struggle to explain. One adaptation is a reduced social threshold. The capacity for interaction narrows, not out of dislike, but out of efficiency. Where once hours of engagement felt tolerable, now even brief exchanges can feel like enough. This isn't intolerance, it's precision. The system has learned exactly how much stimulation it can handle before regulation begins to slip. Another adaptation is a preference for predictable environments. The nervous system relaxes when it can anticipate tone, rhythm, and emotional temperature. Uncertainty requires vigilance. Predictability allows rest. Over time, the body gravitates toward spaces, routines, and people that don't require constant recalibration. Calm becomes more valuable than novelty. There is also a tendency to withdraw, before overload rather than after collapse. This is a sign of learning. Instead of waiting until exhaustion forces a shutdown, the system pulls back early. It recognizes the first signals of strain and responds with distance. From the outside, this can look abrupt. Internally, it feels responsible. Autoregulatory self-sufficiency often follows. The person no longer relies on others to stabilize their internal state. They've learned how to settle themselves through stillness, structure, or solitude. This isn't emotional detachment. It's independence at the nervous system level. Regulation no longer depends on external cues. Finally, silence becomes associated with safety. Not loneliness, but quiet. Silence means no emotional demands, no interpretive labor, no need to perform or respond. In silence, the system doesn't have to defend itself. It can simply exist. That association becomes deeply ingrained. These patterns are often mislabeled as avoidance, rigidity, or coldness. But they are none of those things. They are adaptive responses shaped by experience. The nervous system adjusted to protect energy, stability, and integrity. These are not flaws to be fixed. They are evidence that the system learned how to survive more intelligently than words ever could. What you're experiencing is not random, and it's not uniquely yours. It follows a recognizable psychological pattern that appears across different lives, cultures, and histories. There is an archetype that emerges when a person's nervous system has learned, through repetition, that safety is no longer guaranteed through proximity. These are people who became secure, not because others provided consistency, but because they learn to provide it for themselves. This is where the idea of selective attachment begins to take shape. Connection is no longer sought automatically or indiscriminately. It becomes conditional, intentional, and rare. The body no longer opens simply because someone is present or interested. It opens only when there is a clear signal of safety, predictability, and respect for internal limits. Until then, self-containment feels preferable. In this archetype, calm replaces intensity as the primary marker of connection. High emotional charge, once mistaken for closeness or passion, now registers as instability. The nervous system no longer seeks stimulation to feel alive. It seeks steadiness to feel safe. What once felt exciting may now feel invasive. What once felt bonding may now feel overwhelming. The shift is not emotional numbness. It is a refined sensitivity to what the body can tolerate without losing equilibrium. People who embody this pattern often appear independent, grounded, or even distant from the outside. Internally, however, they are not disconnected. They are regulated. Their sense of safety is no longer outsourced. They don't need constant reassurance, mirroring, or emotional intensity to stay balanced. Silence doesn't threaten them. Distance doesn't destabilize them. Being alone doesn't activate fear. It activates rest. This archetype removes the illusion that security must come from others. The body has learned how to self-soothe, self-stabilize, and self-anchor. That learning didn't come from theory or affirmation. It came from necessity. From realizing again and again that relying on external regulation was unreliable or costly. Seen this way, the preference for solitude is not a failure of attachment. It is an evolution of it. The system didn't shut down its need for connection. It refined it. Calm became the baseline. Selectivity became wisdom, and the body learned that it could feel safe without depending on anyone else to make that possible. For many people, solitude has quietly shifted from something to endure into something that sustains them. Not because they gave up on connection, but because their nervous system discovered that being alone offered something it could not reliably find elsewhere: regulation. In solitude, the body is no longer scanning for emotional shifts, anticipating reactions, or preparing to adjust itself to someone else's internal state. The background tension fades, breathing deepens, the system settles. Silence in this context is not emptiness. It is the absence of threat. When there is no demand to respond, perform, or explain, the nervous system finally stands down from vigilance. Muscles release. Attention returns inward. The constant low-level alertness that accompanied social interaction dissipates. What remains is not loneliness but stability. This is why solitude doesn't feel like running away. It feels like coming home. Homeostasis, by definition, is the body's ability to maintain internal balance. When environments repeatedly disrupt that balance, the system seeks alternatives. Solitude becomes one of those alternatives, not because it is ideal in theory, but because it works in practice. It allows the nervous system to reset without effort. From the outside, this preference is often misunderstood as withdrawal or emotional shutdown. But inside, there is no collapse. There is organization. Thoughts become clearer. Emotional reactions soften. The body no longer has to brace. In the absence of external stimulation, the system can complete regulatory cycles that were previously interrupted. This reframing matters because it removes the pressure to fix the solitude. There is nothing to correct when the system is doing exactly what it needs to do. The goal is not isolation, but equilibrium. The system didn't isolate itself because it failed. It stabilized itself because it learned what balance required. Seen through this lens, solitude is not an endpoint. It is a regulatory space, a place where the nervous system can recalibrate without interference, a condition that allows internal order to return. The withdrawal is not against life or connection. It is in service of restoring the internal conditions that make both possible. This shift towards solitude does not mean connection is permanently closed. It means access has become conditional. The nervous system no longer opens by default. It opens only in environments where safety is felt, not promised, where presence does not require effort, where interaction does not demand self-abandonment or constant regulation. If that safety is not present, the body stays protected, regardless of what the mind might want. The decision happens beneath conscious thought. Before you weigh the pros and cons, the body already knows whether an interaction will cost more than it gives. Tightening or ease appears first. Expansion or withdrawal happens before language. This is not avoidance. It is discernment operating at a physiological level. Because of this, not every connection deserves access. Proximity alone is no longer enough. Familiarity is not enough. History is not enough. The nervous system responds to how it feels now, not to what something once was or should be. Where there is emotional drain, unpredictability, or pressure, the system remains closed. Where there is calm, consistency, and respect for limits, it may open naturally. This makes the return selective, not rigid. The system is not refusing connection. It is waiting for the conditions under which connection no longer disrupts its balance. Openness, when it comes, is not forced. It emerges where there is no cost to being oneself, where regulation is mutual, and where presence feels sustainable rather than draining. When all of this is brought together, a clear pattern emerges. Emotional exhaustion was not just felt psychologically, it was learned somatically. The body paid attention long before the mind could explain what was happening. Through repeated experiences of overload, misalignment, and constant emotional demand, the nervous system adapted. It learned what drained it and what restored it, not through reflection, but through sensation. Solitude became associated with regulation, because it consistently allowed the system to settle. In silence, there was no need to monitor, adjust, or protect. The body could finally complete its regulatory cycles without interruption. What looked like withdrawal was actually stabilization. The system was not turning away from life. It was restoring balance. Over time, this learning matured into preference. Silence no longer felt empty. It felt sufficient. Calm replaced intensity as the baseline. The need for constant stimulation faded. This shift is not emotional shutdown. It is nervous system maturity. The system now recognizes its limits and responds before collapse occurs. Seen this way, nothing went wrong. Something integrated. The body chose what reduced strain and preserved integrity. The mind may still search for reasons, labels, or explanations, but the truth is simpler. The body understood first. And what it chose was not isolation, but the conditions under which it could finally remain whole. If you notice that you feel calmer when you are alone, this is not a defect in you. If contact feels heavier than it used to, if conversations require more energy than they give back, that shift is not random. If silence brings relief instead of loneliness, your system is responding intelligently to what it has learned. You didn't lose the ability to connect. Your body refined it. It learned what overstimulates you and what restores you. When the noise stops and your breathing slows, that is regulation, not withdrawal. When you choose distance and feel steadier rather than empty, that is not avoidance. It is alignment. Nothing about this means you are broken, cold, or incapable of closeness. It means your nervous system adjusted to protect its balance. It found a calmer baseline and learned how to maintain it. That learning didn't come from theory or self-help. It came from experience. So if you recognize yourself here, there is nothing to fix. There is something to understand. What changed in you was not your capacity for feeling, but your tolerance for dysregulation. The quiet you seek is not escape. It is where your system finally feels safe enough to rest. And that didn't damage you. It adjusted you in the only way that made sense. This space is not built for noise or performance. It's for those who learned, often quietly, how to protect themselves without hardening. If you've reached a point where your nervous system values calm over intensity, clarity over chaos, and safety over constant connection, you're already aligned with what this space holds. There's no pressure here to explain yourself or to be more than you are. Presence is enough. If something in this video reflected your own experience, you don't need to justify it. A simple comment is enough. A small signal that says, "I recognize this." That's all. If you want to continue exploring these ideas in a way that respects depth and regulation, consider subscribing. Not as a commitment, but as a quiet continuation. The content here isn't meant to push or provoke. It's meant to offer understanding without demand. This is a space where nothing needs to be defended, where insight unfolds at a pace the nervous system can tolerate. If that feels right, you're welcome to stay.